All right. Good morning, everybody. Um, for this lecture today, I want to talk about the Great Depression. We're in this Great Depression unit, and you guys have done some discussion work and some assignments so far. But what I want to specifically talk about today is the Great Depression and the role of the federal government. Because what we're going to see during this decade of the 1930s is we are going to see in maybe the most dramatic way in American history the role of the federal government in terms of the economy and in terms of the welfare of the people is going to change more dramatically than perhaps it ever has. Um, I'm going to go into the Great Depression page. And for this lecture, I'm going to look at down here in the links, I'm going to use these three documents. So if you want to go back and look at any of these, this is where they're at. I'm going to use FDR's inauguration speech, this little chart, and then some cartoons from this classwork assignment. Hopefully at this point, you've studied the problems of the Great Depression and you did a little bit of work comparing Herbert Hoover and FDR. This video was part of that assignment. So this video is very helpful to understanding this as well. But for now, let's go to FDR's inauguration speech. The Great Depression began during Hoover's term, 1929. And at the end of his first term, Hoover's going to try to get reelected, but he's not going to be popular enough to do that. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, will be elected president in the middle of the Great Depression. Really, he's elected when the Great Depression is at its peak. Sorry, I'm going to set a timer. He comes into office when the Great Depression, I said, is at its worst. Some of the statistics that you guys gave me, unemployment was at an all-time high. 25% of Americans were out of work. It was about 12.5 million people at that time without a job. Home foreclosures had grown like never before during those first 4 years. Hundreds of thousands of people were losing their homes every year during the Great Depression. I think in 1931, 32, it was like in the 200,000s per year were losing their home. And another statistic, the suicide rate was at an all-time high. People had lost hope and were in despair, and that was a record high as well in 1932, the suicide rate. So here's FDR. He's taking office. America is in despair. Hoover, as you guys pointed out, had largely taken a hands-off approach to fixing the Great Depression. It wasn't that he didn't think things need to be done, but he didn't think that it was the role of the federal government to force things to happen. Hoover encouraged what was called voluntarism, meaning he wanted people to voluntarily pull together to remedy the Great Depression. He asked business owners, just please don't lay people off. Don't put people out of work. Keep them on. Run your business at lower profits. And he asked people to do that voluntarily. He believed that in terms of like feeding the homeless or helping people who had lost their homes, that it was the role of like churches and private organizations, charitable, nonprofit organizations, and that people who weren't as affected by the Great, and he would be one of them. Hoover was a millionaire and was not touched very much by the Great Depression in that sense. He felt like it was the people who had means to voluntarily contribute, get involved, and serve in their churches and their nonprofit organizations and so forth. So Hoover believed that the federal government did not have the role to step in and directly relieve the people. It was called direct relief, and he said no. Now, by his last year in office, things had gotten so bad that Hoover did begin to do some things, and you guys told me about that. He began the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to fund certain projects. He started a federal project on the Boulder Dam, which will later be called the Hoover Dam, and this was to provide utilities and power and work to many Americans. So by the end of his 4 years, he had started to come around to this idea that maybe the federal government did need to do some things. But by and large, Hoover said, hands off, voluntarism. The federal government does not have a role in fixing this Great Depression. FDR will be elected, and in 1933, he gives an inaugural address that completely changes that belief. I'm just going to read it. He says, "This nation asks for action and action now," meaning the people. It is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly adequate to meet this unprecedented task before us. So he's saying people want the government to intervene. And he's like, hopefully the executive, the president, and the legislative Congress can do this, in the normal balance of power. But, and this is an important but right there, it may be that an unprecedented demand and a need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from the normal balance of public procedure. If the Congress fails to act, and that should say act, I shall seek broad executive power to wage a war against this emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. The people have registered a mandate. They want direct, vigorous action, and in the spirit of the gift, I take it. What FDR is saying is people want the government to provide relief. And he says if Congress is not passing those relief bills, that he, as president, will overstep checks and balances, that he would maybe even violate the Constitution to provide the relief that people are asking for. That is scary talk, because he's saying the president and the federal government are going to provide relief even if constitutionally or Congress is not willing to go there. This is important because this is one of the worst moments in our nation's history, and people want the government to act, and the government needs to act, but at what cost? But you have to remember, in 1933, the same year that FDR comes to power is also the same year Adolf Hitler will become chancellor in Germany. And fascism in Italy and military dictatorship in Japan are all on the increase. The whole world was struggling because of the Great Depression. And in many countries, the answer to that was dictatorship. It was totalitarianism. FDR is flirting with that line right there. He's saying, I will act. I will seek broad power. I will make the changes if Congress does not. Now, thankfully, FDR does not have to do the extremes to which he is maybe hinting at here. Because of his bold leadership, Congress will follow suit. And what's going to be called the New Deal, FDR's solution, so to speak, to the Great Depression, is all going to be a series of laws that are passed by Congress. But we typically call it FDR's New Deal because FDR set the tone right there that it was the role of the federal government to get involved and to help the people who were struggling during the Great Depression. And really from this time on, the federal government will have and play that role to a greater and greater extent all the way up to today. This is a little secondary source from a book by H.W. Brands, and he says it this way. I'm just going to skip down. He says, capitalist individualism, the philosophy of every man for himself, no longer persuaded. That's kind of Hoover's motto, capitalist individualism. Whether democratic collectivism, the belief that we're all in this together, could do better, was the question of the hour. This democratic collectivism, the people voting in change, then Congress and the president enacting change on behalf of the people, is this idea of democratic collectivism. Critics will later call this socialism, or even flirting with communism. But FDR believes that the federal government has to act and pass laws and enact policies to put people back to work, to put money back in people's pockets, to get people off of the street, put food on the table. And in 1933, he's going to start trying to solve the Great Depression, with what is called the New Deal. Now, very quickly, The New Deal, if you remember from the video, is just a flood of new laws and agencies. They almost all have acronyms. And sometimes the New Deal is referred to as alphabet soup. People ask me, what laws do I need to know? There was the AAA and the NIRA and the FERA and the CWA and the CCC and the WPA and the TVA and the NLRB and the FDIC and the SEC. And it just goes on. And it's like, how can I remember? What do I need to know? Here, this chart gives you a short description of New Deal policies. You can break the New Deal down into what are called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And relief measures were meant to do just that, provide immediate relief. Recovery was to help the economy begin to grow, get people buying and selling again. And then reform were preventative programs to protect the American economy from ever letting something like this happen again. My encouragement to you would be to know maybe 2 from each of these columns. So I would probably say definitely know the CCC and the FERA. These 2 laws provided relief. They put people back to work. They gave temporary jobs. They put direct handouts, what today we would call stimulus money, right into people's hands to help them pay their bills and to buy food. Relief. For recovery, I would know these first 2, the AAA and the NIRA. Sometimes the NIRA is just called the NRA, not Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration. This was for farm workers and this was for factory workers. This was kind of FDR's double-barreled shotgun to fix the Great Depression. Help farmers, help industrial factory workers. Side note, and this will come back later in the week, both of these New Deal plans are going to be ruled unconstitutional. These are going to be 2 examples of FDR maybe taking too much power. So those will both be unconstitutional. Reform, maybe know a couple of these, probably maybe the SEC and Social Security. These are big ones for today. The SEC regulates the stock market, and Social Security provides old age retirement fund. It's a cash transfer from current workers to retirees. You don't have to know every New Deal agency, every law, but if you know a couple of them around these ideas of relief, recovery, and reform, I think you're going to be in good shape. And again, the big idea is never before had the federal government assumed the role of taking care of these issues. If business was struggling, it's laissez-faire. It's survival of the fittest. If people are out of work, homeless, need food, well, it's the job of churches and charities to fix that. It's not the role of the federal government until now. And that's the big change during the Great Depression. The last thing that I'll show you for this lecture, because I know we're up to a little over almost 15 minutes, is a couple of cartoons. This worksheet would be something that in a normal year we would work through in class. We would look up some of the programs. We would answer some questions. But these 2 cartoons show 2 views of FDR's New Deal and this new rule of government. FDR says this is not revolutionary. This is evolutionary, meaning that this is the natural progression. It starts with academic ideas. He had an Ivy League advisory team, and the natural growth was an outflow of government programs. These are modern times, these are modern problems, and modern governments needed to act to fix them. Not revolution, evolution, natural growth. This cartoon shows the exact opposite. It shows FDR's team shoveling money out of the wagon, which is riding recklessly. You see a communist dictator over here. Stalin is looking on approvingly. Spend, spend, spend. The New Deal cost a ton of money. The national debt for America and the American government during the Great Depression more than doubled. Many people said all of this government relief was just a modified version of communism, socialism, reckless spending that drove America further into debt and made American people more dependent on the federal government. So, two sides to every story. This new role of government, FDR says it's just natural. This is what governments need to do. Others said this was reckless and dangerous and was un American. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the Supreme Court and some of the judicial legislation regarding the New Deal. But the big idea today is for you to understand that the role of the federal government in terms of everyday people's life was changing. And this debate still happens, although it happens at a much different place in the spectrum. So, for example, we're having this same debate right now during the coronavirus pandemic on how much relief the federal government should do, our mask mandates, overstepping bounds, and things like that. The federal government, though, because of the New Deal, has already assumed the right to intervene. And the question today is not should the government intervene. That decision was decided during the Great Depression. The Great Depression said, yes, the government should intervene. And today, that will happen. The question today is how much is too much. So that's just one kind of current parallel from those times to these times. Back then, nobody had the expectation that the government should intervene, and FDR and the Great Depression changed that. Today, everybody expects the government to intervene in some ways. The question is just how much is too much, and who's going to benefit from those stimulus packages and those regulations. All right, that's it for this. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a great week.